VikesNow. I am Dustin Baker. I'm here with our usual Wednesday guest, the editor of Purple PTSD, Josh Frey, and we have a very special guest, Jeff Diamond, who was the Vikings general manager when I became a fan. So this is really cool. Jeff, how are you? How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great, Dustin, and good to talk with you and Josh today.
Absolutely. We're going to roll right into it. I have a question that's been eating at me for a few days. Last week we had the Senior Bowl, and there seemed to be some rumor that, or a veteran anonymous agent said, he wondered in the Vikings search for a quarterback, which side would win out, the general manager, the head coach, or the owner. And it got me to thinking that you would be a good person to ask with your experience in the league then and now. Outside of like Jerry Jones, what is the relationship usually between a general manager, head coach, and an ownership? Like, does the owner say, here's what you're going to do it? Or does a general manager usually have full autonomy?
Yeah, in my experience, and I think it's predominant around the NFL and in most pro sports, the owner really delegates the responsibility to the GM to do that job, and that's why they were hired. And so, whether I was the GM of the Vikings or when I was team president in Tennessee, and then I worked with our general manager at the time, and the head coach, of course, always has input too.
Mm-hmm.
But generally speaking, the owner stays kind of above the fray, shall we say, and that he's going to delegate that responsibility. That's why these people are hired. And I think when that is not the case, unless it's an unusual situation, such as Jerry Jones, who is the owner, GM, president, etc., then it becomes a big problem. And I think we've seen that in places such as Washington with Daniel Snyder, when he would get too much involved in some free agent signings over the years. And there are other examples, David Tepper, perhaps recently in Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where teams get into trouble. And so, yeah, fortunately for me, in my experience, I was always delegated that responsibility as a GM. And in terms of the salary cap, in terms of contract signings, certainly the owner will give the GM a cash budget, which can be a little bit different from the salary cap budget, because obviously sometimes you exceed the cap on the cash side, and then the signing bonus is spread over the life of the contract. And so I would go to, for example, Bud Adams in Tennessee, who was my owner there. And if I was going to sign Steve McNair, Eddie George, one of our star players, I'd say, hey, Bud, we need $10 million to sign Eddie. We need $15 million to sign Steve. And he would invariably say yes, because he understood it was a long-term contract. And but in terms of the cap, we always were able to spend to the cap. And the owner would say, hey, you understand that if you pay more than you want for a certain player, you may have to pay a certain amount less for another player, because the pie is only so big. And but fortunately, I never had a situation where my ownership group said you can't spend to the cap. And I think that's really detrimental, I think, competitively to teams in this day and age.
Is there any scenario based on your knowledge of the sport where an owner would say, for example, the Wilfs, we want you to keep Kirk Cousins for at least a year, but also draft the next guy? Would they even have that type of input, or would that be fully up to Kwesi Adolpho-Mensah to decide Cousins' future?
Well, I think in a player of that magnitude, where the expenditure is so great, I'm sure that Ziggy and Mark Wilf are going to sit down with Kwesi and with Kevin O'Connell and say, what are you thinking here? What do you think makes the most sense long term for the franchise and short term? And I would certainly figure that those guys would say, we want to re-sign Kirk for a couple of years and draft our quarterback of the future, perhaps potentially in the first round. Maybe it could be in the second round if a player that's not worthy at number 11, or if they could even trade up into the top 10. But realistically, those top three quarterbacks are going to go boom, boom, boom. Caleb Williams, Drake May, Jaden Daniels are going to go probably 1, 2, 3. And for the Vikings to get in the top three, that would require a multitude of future first round picks. And I don't know that they want to mortgage the future like that on a quarterback, when history tells you that out of all these first round quarterbacks, there are going to be some busts.
Mhm.
And we've seen that whether it's Zach Wilson recently with the Jets or over time, historically, there have always been a number of quarterbacks, even going back to Ryan Leaf and Peyton Manning, where some guys make it big and some guys don't. And so if you take that approach and put all your chips towards that first round quarterback and it doesn't pan out, really disastrous. And we just saw that in another recent draft with Sam Darnold and Josh Rosen, both first round picks that didn't pan out for their teams. So it's a dangerous garden. And so, but to answer the question, I think yes, the Wilfs will want to get a good feel before free agency starts, because in Kirk's case, they can't franchise him. So they really probably need to get a deal done by March 11th. And kind of the same situation with Danielle Hunter. And they're going to want to know, what are you thinking on Danielle? And obviously the Justin Jefferson extension is in play. And that's a key component too, from the standpoint that if the Vikings have 25 to 30 million of cap room right now, well, if they get Cousins done, they can get his cap number down from 28 million in dead money. If they get Jefferson done, he's got a $19.7 million cap number for this year. And if you give him a big signing bonus, you can probably get his cap number for 2024 down by about $9 to $10 million. And that can help them to sign Hunter, to maybe bring back DJ Wanham, or go out into free agency and get a better player than Marcus Davenport, for example. So these things are all tied together. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is it has to happen pretty quick, because especially with Cousins and Hunter not being able to be franchised, they almost have to get something done with those guys before March 11th. And my philosophy always was, the danger of free agency is all it takes is one team out of 32 to blow you out of the water. And so if somebody comes in and say Brock Purdy has a terrible Super Bowl, and all of a sudden Kyle Shanahan says, maybe we need to go after Kirk Cousins, you kind of want to short circuit that as quick as you can.
Agreed.
Speaking on just Kwesi and KOC and how big this offseason really is for those two guys, they're halfway through their contracts right now. And I think particularly this draft is going to be really important for them to find some sort of starting caliber talent for them, just to improve, especially the defensive side of the ball. Maybe they go after that quarterback. But do you think halfway through these contracts heading into this 2024 offseason, have they done enough to necessarily get contract extensions to stay longer? Or what do you think they need to do this offseason to really impress the Wilfs and ensure that those contract extensions?
And I don't necessarily think, Josh, that they're tied at the hip either.
Right.
And I think there is probably more pressure on Kwesi based on the last two drafts and what happened, especially in 2022, with trading out of that 12th spot. You pass on Kyle Hamilton, first team All-Pro. You pass on Trent McDuffie, first team All-Pro corner, Hamilton safety, and you draft Lewis Cine, who has done nothing so far. Now, perhaps he'll have an opportunity this year, especially if Harrison Smith retires, in that three safety look. And it looks like Brian Flores is back, which I think is a good thing for the team and the defense. But so far, Cine has not justified that first round pick and trading out of that spot. And as for that trade, to get the extra pick, they take Andrew Booth, and they've needed help at corner, and he's kind of behind three other guys at this point. So I think you look at those drafts, and Jordan Addison was a great pick. We will definitely say that for Kwesi, but beyond that, there just haven't been enough hits in the draft, especially with those high picks. Ed Ingram is still kind of a question mark at guard about how good he is. And Ty Chandler, good fifth round pick. But other than Addison and Chandler, it's hard to really put a finger on who's been a really good draft pick so far. And I saw some good things out of Mekhi Blackman early last year, but he seemed to regress later in the year. especially when the pass rush diminished, when Wanham got hurt. And so he's a question mark. And I think the pressure is more, in my mind, on Kwesi to draft starting caliber guys in the first and second round, especially, and even in the later rounds, because we've seen later round picks become successful, obviously, around the league. And maybe this could be the year that Scene comes on. He's a year removed from that major injury. Maybe Booth finally gets it and becomes a better consistent player, but I don't know that he can ever stay healthy for a whole year. And Brian Asamoah, we saw some really good things out of him in his rookie season, and then he was basically hurt all last season. So it's a tough deal. The draft is an inexact science. We know that. And you come up with a guy like Ivan Pace Jr., that's a feather in Kwesi's cap to sign a guy like that as an undrafted free agent. But not enough of those guys have made an impact draft-wise. And then you look at a team like Detroit that had a great draft last year with all these guys like Gibbs and Laporta stepping into the lineup immediately and making a huge impact on a team that got to the Final Four. So Kevin O'Connell, 13 wins his first year. Even last year, with all the difficulties at quarterback, and yeah, Kevin's had some moments where he's made some bad decisions and some bad clock management at the end of the Chargers game, for example, and the tush push and what was that in Cincinnati?
Yep.
With Brandon Powell. Oh my gosh. So there are some issues that he has to continue to improve as a play caller, offensive coordinator. But I think as a head coach, he's gotten the players to buy in. They play hard for him. He made a really good hire with Flores. So to me, I think the pressure is more on Kwesi, less on O'Connell, who, unless it's a disastrous season in 2024, which I don't expect it to be, because I think that they could very easily get back to a playoff status team if they make several key moves, starting with re-sign Cousins, re-sign Hunter, because the pass rush would be a disaster without him unless you draft guys in the first and second round, they're greatest rookies, which is rare. And I think that then you go from there and get Jefferson solidified for the long term, get his cap number down, and then do better in the draft and coach these guys up. But so I don't think it's going to be that kind of really down season. I think they can get back to the playoffs very easily if they make the right moves.
Jeff, speaking of Cousins, if the Vikings re-sign him for a 7th season, I think the three of us consider it a true coin flip right now, whether or not that happens. It sounds like Cousins is more open to testing free agency than he would have been in any year past with the Vikings. If they do re-sign him again, do they at all risk doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result?
I don't necessarily think so, Dustin. To me, when Cousins got hurt in week 8 last year, he was really playing very well. He was 3rd ranked in passer rating in the league. The team had won 3 straight games, including that Green Bay game when he got hurt, but it was late in the game. And there's no doubt in my mind that if he had not gotten hurt last year, the Vikings would have been a playoff team because they needed 2 more wins to make the playoffs. And there were at least 4 games that I think he could have won when you think about Denver, Cincinnati, the Detroit game, the Chicago game here. Mm-hmm. So many games where the quarterback play was subpar, so many turnovers. And yeah, he might not have won all 4 of those. He would have won 2 of those 4 for sure, and the Vikings would have been in the playoffs. Mm-hmm. And so it's a totally different mindset at that point in time. So I think also you consider if he's re-signed, it's his 3rd year with O'Connell in the system. He's got a great supporting cast of skilled players. If they can get better on the offensive line in basically all spots, they've got talent on that offensive line. They got to coach those guys up. Even Darisaw at the end of the year, whether he was nicked or whatever, wasn't as effective. O'Neal got hurt, wasn't as effective. And those guys are really quality players. If they can get them back to where they were and then coach up the rest of the guys, I still think Garrett Bradbury is a question mark at center. Maybe they can draft a guy that develops there and eventually replaces him. But generally speaking, the skilled players are really good, especially if Hawkinson hopefully recovers well from his injury. And so, yeah, I don't necessarily think they're spinning their wheels on Kirk if they re-sign him, because it will be his third year with O'Connell in this system with these players. And let's remember, his first 5 years in Minnesota, he had a different coordinator every year, different system, basically, in a lot of respects. And he also had a head coach who didn't believe in him with Mike Zimmer. So it just makes the most sense to me to re-sign Cousins. I still think he was playing at a caliber of a top 10 quarterback last year. And if you go in the draft and you're at number 11, there's no guarantee you're going to certainly probably not get one of those top 3 guys. And if you make a pick of a JJ McCarthy or a Michael Penix or a Bo Nix, how quick are they going to develop? Unlikely they're going to play at the level of Cousins in 2024. So to me, I think that makes the most sense. But I also say, as part of that process, I would definitely look very strongly at drafting a quarterback in the first round at number 11 or moving up a couple spots, but not necessarily having to move up in the top 3 and give up your next 2 years of number 1s and number 2s to make that leap. But I think if they were able to do that, and maybe you sit and wait into the second round, maybe you take that edge rusher in the first round, or that impact corner that you need so badly. Maybe you take one of those players and take your chances around that maybe Penix or Nix or McCarthy fall to that point. It's possible. It's happened before. And you look historically, there are certainly a lot of quality second, third round type quarterbacks. And even later, think about Brock Purdy and Tom Brady, who have emerged. Russell Wilson, third round. Joe Montana, third round.
Kirk.
Drew Brees.
Kirk, yeah.
We go on and on. And Kirk in the fourth round. That's right.
Yeah, that kind of alludes to my next question for you. I know it's really tough to, at this point in the offseason, kind of determine what position is the biggest need for the Vikings before we really know what's going to happen with Kirk, Daniil, who they're going to sign in free agency. But at this point, looking at this draft, I think there's a lot of quality quarterbacks, obviously. The Vikings could use one for the future, especially if they move on from Kirk. But like you said, they could also use a pass rusher or a cornerback to really solidify those rooms. What do you think really is the biggest need for this Vikings team in the draft as of right now? And do you have a name that you think would fit the Vikings at this point?
Yeah, I don't necessarily have a name, but I just think that I think the quarterback position is so important in the NFL these days, and if they could figure out or find the guy, and it could be McCarthy, for example, I'm not sure about Penix after watching him in the national championship, but he certainly had a great semifinal. But he's also 24 years old. McCarthy, I think, is 20 years old. He's kind of a guy that is really kind of interesting to think about, maybe at 11, and it could happen. But then again, that edge rusher spot or the corner spots are such a big need. But maybe they can get that guy in the second round, and maybe I don't think they have a third rounder right now, but maybe they can trade up in the third round and get a guy too. But those are the 3 positions definitely that are, I'm sure, are top of the radar for the Vikings, and as they're going through their draft prep and getting ready to go to the combine in a couple of weeks, and really studying especially the quarterbacks, edge rushers, and the cornerbacks. So that would be where I would be looking. But to me, if you can draft a quarterback in the first round, have him sit for even maybe 2 years, but for sure 1 year. That's what Patrick Mahomes did. Where did Patrick Mahomes get drafted? Number 10.
Right. Yeah.
After the Chiefs traded up to get him, and he sat for a year. His second year, he's MVP in the league. His third year, he wins the Super Bowl. So that's not a bad formula. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of Patrick Mahomes out there. And speaking of which, guys, I'm not picking against Patrick Mahomes in the Super Bowl. I've learned my lesson.
Me too.
I'm right there with you. Yeah.
All of us. Yeah.
I picked Buffalo to beat Kansas City. I picked Baltimore to beat Kansas City. I was wrong on both of those. And that's what I wrote about today in Vikings territory. I'm picking Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs this year.
Yeah.
On Sunday.
I think across the board, we all got hoodwinked into thinking, well, if the Bills are ever going to do it, it's going to be now at home. Same for the Ravens, right. Lamar's big year. So, yeah, I think across the board, we got hoodwinked. Josh, we got time for one more quick one. What do you got?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, we spent a lot of this time talking about free agency, the draft. But taking a look at the guys that are on the current roster, like over the past couple of years, we've seen some guys like KJ Osborne, Cam Bynum last year, Josh Metellus last year, even Ivan Pace coming out of nowhere as an undrafted rookie. What's one guy that you think on this current roster right now could be the next guy up in terms of having that sort of breakout season with the Vikings in 2024?
I think it could be Jalen Naylor. I think he's a guy that has really flashed some athletic ability. Now, he hasn't been able to stay healthy necessarily, especially last season. But to me, if they need to free up some cap money to sign Hunter, to do the Cousins deal, even though that'll save cap room, but also cash-wise with Jefferson's deal, for example, and maybe get DJ Wanham back. I think Jalen Naylor is a guy. Maybe they look at KJ Osborne and say, well, is he worth $3 to $5 million a year, or if someone's going to pay him more than that? I think he's a guy that they could say, well, we'll let KJ leave. He had a lot of drops last year and certainly made some big plays. We know that. And he's a talented player. But I think Naylor is a guy that when he's been in there could certainly fill that role as that kind of third receiver. And then you bring back Brandon Powell as kind of your swing guy to help out when someone gets nicked. And I like Jalen Naylor as a possible replacement for KJ Osborne. I also think obviously Ty Chandler is going to have a bigger role next year. He unless they all of a sudden draft a running back in the first round, which we certainly don't expect, Chandler should be the starter ahead of Alexander Madison. And Madison still has a role on the team. He's still a good enough player to be that number 2 back that he did very well behind Dalvin Cook for so many years. But to me, Ty Chandler should be the starter from day one. And I think he could have a bigger year, especially on an offense that has guys like Jefferson and Addison and Hawkinson that defenses really have to respect. So they can't load up the box to stop the run game necessarily. So I'll say Naylor as kind of under the radar guy, and Chandler is a guy that's kind of more well known at this point. And maybe Asamoah, if he can stay healthy. We saw some good things out of him his rookie year at times. And I remember he made a big play. I think it was the first Giants game, forced a fumble, and he has speed. We know that, but he couldn't stay healthy last year. So maybe he's a guy, if they decide, well, maybe we don't want to pay Jordan Hicks $5 million or whatever. And Jordan got hurt last year. He's getting older. Maybe Asamoah is a guy that they give the opportunity to step in, and maybe he can step up in that role in his third season. But I think they like Hicks as a leader, and I expect him to be back. So we'll see how that all plays out. But so to answer the question, I'll say Jalen Naylor.
Yeah, I think Ivan Pace got in the way of Brian Asamoah in a very good way, and I think that's what stunted his development, at least temporarily. So you got Jalen Naylor as your breakout. You got the Chiefs winning the Super Bowl. Let's see. On Twitter, it's Jeff Diamond NFL. Is that correct?
At Jeff Diamond NFL. Yes.
And then where do you write?
Then I write for, besides my Vikings territory, of course, I write for the 33rd team.
Okay.
It is a kind of a website with a lot of former team executives, coaches, players. Fun group to write for, and so I wrote this week about Patrick Mahomes.
Yeah.
And I said I'm not picking against Patrick Mahomes anymore this postseason. Probably in any postseason.
This happened to me during that Super Bowl between the Chiefs and the Buccaneers. I picked the Chiefs, and I woke up Monday morning thinking, how on earth did I pick against Tom Brady in a Super Bowl? And so I know where you're coming from. All right, Jeff, we'd like to have you back maybe after the draft to kind of
Sure.
decompress what free agency told us and what the draft showed us, I should say. We appreciate it, and we hope you had a good time. Any closing arguments, Jeff?
No, I think it's just it's an interesting time, and certainly my work with my agent firm IFA. We had a big meeting yesterday about prospects, and we've got a bunch of guys in the draft coming up, and so it's kind of a fun time of year, maybe a little bit under the radar for the average fan until you get the agency in the draft. But there's a lot going on. Combine is 2 weeks away now. Just got done with the Senior Bowl. And obviously the Super Bowl this week. So I think it's a really busy time of year for team executives as they get ready for the combine, and then kind of that over analysis period before the draft. And I think what also kind of a final thought when you think about draft choices and trying to identify players and just the inexact science of the draft, and looking at Brock Purdy, for example, this week as a 7th-round pick, starting in his second season in the Super Bowl, it just shows the inexact science of the draft. And I think too many talent evaluators, player personnel people, GMs, coaches get hung up on the measurables that happen at the combine, for example, and pro days. And I would always tell our scouting staff, our coaches, and everybody as we evaluate the players before the draft and even in free agency, I would say, let's look at how they played, not as much on what their numbers were, what their speed is, what their how many reps they do on the lifting bench, for example. And because I think what's more important is how do they play. And I always think back to John Randall, who I signed as an undrafted free agent for $5,000 after the draft in whatever 19. And when we went into the draft, he was 240 pounds, had played at small college Texas A&I that became later Texas A&M Kingsville or something. And you talk about under the radar, his brother had played in the NFL, but John was undersized, so he was not drafted. And so we signed him. I paid him a $5,000 signing bonus. He shows up at training camp, not 240, but 270. There
you go.
Nutrition he got on, and all of a sudden, John Randall was a different guy. And by his second season, he's basically a starter. Mm-hmm. And then whatever it was 8 years later, I made him the highest paid defensive player in the NFL. Yeah. So, and now he's in the Hall of Fame. So yeah. I think about guys like, I think of Chris Carter and Jerry Rice, who probably ran 4.5 maybe, but they ran great routes, had great hands, were so competitive. And a receiver doesn't have to run 4.25 to be a great player in the league.
Yeah, Puka Nacua is the most recent example, and even Jerry Rice's son isn't crazy fast coming out of this draft. So,
right.
All right, well, we'll have you back, sir, in about 3 months. Josh Frey, we'll see you in 1 week. I appreciate it, gentlemen. You have a wonderful day, okay?
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Take it easy.